Hello everyone. My spirit name or my traditional name is Sotnyowa. I come from the people of the Standing Stone Nation located outside of London, Ontario. I come from a specific Bear Clan nation, Bear Clan family, excuse me. And what I had said in my language is that today is a good day and I'm happy to be here. I gave thanks to Sunkwantizon, our creator, for our mother the earth, Yonkinola Ohunjade. I also gave thanks to our creator for the people who are here in the audience, but also to the people who are watching. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to witness and to watch, what we're going to be presenting here today. What I want to do now is say that as a visitor and a guest out here on the Coast Salish people's unceded territories of the Hulkamanum speaking people, I have a responsibility to do a land acknowledgement. And so what I'm going to say is in my language now, which is Galiwayan dagun on dunga ingawani slate jitnawini salio kalit wagatsununi jit wagada jatwe ezogonalunqua sunquantezo ne yunkinola hunjade ne ungwehoe ne swakwego ga ingawani slate ohunjio. So what I had said is that today I have a responsibility to give thanks to the Indigenous people's territory that I am on. I said that it's a beautiful earth, and I'm happy, and it's a privilege for me to be here. And so today, I'm going to jump right in it. I want to again say thank you for everyone that's here, everyone who's watching, and everybody that's in the audience. These are all awesome for being here. I want to give a shout out to all the volunteers and the people who are helping out. I think it's important to say that without all of you here, we wouldn't have the opportunity to have Expressions of Reclamation take place. So I want to say a big thank you from my heart to all of you. In my language, it's and so what I said is that you are all a medicine, you are all a really big medicine to me, and that I thank you. And so I want to say that from my heart, to yours. So today, on Expressions of Reclamation, we're going to be showcasing an amazing, awesome artist. Her name is Kaija. Like the previous showcases, I have said that this is not the Sotnyowa show, that it's the Kaija show. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like Kaija, to introduce herself, and so I'm going to pass it over to her, and she'll introduce herself. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia, for that introduction. Hello, bonjour tout le monde. Tanishikia Wow, Kaija Heitland and I, on Michif Nia, on Vancouver, New Weekend. My name is Kaija Heitland. Welcome everyone to my presentation. I am a Métis woman living in British Columbia. I belong to the Cowichan Valley Métis Nation, where my parents reside, and I live in Vancouver on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish. I am really excited to be presenting today in this series of artists talking about reclamation and reconciliation, because it's a huge part of the culture that I grew up in, where as a Métis person, unsure of exactly where they sit in the world, culturally we really experience a displacement in a real way. And I believe that art, and especially traditional arts, are one of the foundational things that we can go back to help to identify where we have our strengths and our roots, and to explore all of our roots as being Indigenous people of mixed ancestral descent. I was really brought up to believe that being half something or a quarter something didn't make you less than, but made you twice as much. And I absolutely love and honor all of the different groups that I come from. So from my Métis side of the family, my grandparents, my mother's parents were Métis and Finnish Sami, Indigenous from Scandinavia. And my father is German from mostly Scandinavian roots as well. But through our Métis side, we have quite a bit of French and Scottish. Our first white ancestors came to Canada in the 1620s. So that side of my family has been here for a long time, intermixing. And for me, so much of the Métis art that I was seeing really didn't reflect the diverse cultures that contributed to the development of our art, but as this beautiful mélange, this pot, and the development of the flower beadwork that we're known for. The Métis are known as the flower beadwork people, the flower people. And through our embroidery and our beadwork, we're identified distinctly from other groups. In British Columbia, we have roughly 90,000 Métis individuals that live here, which constitutes about 33% of the Indigenous population in British Columbia. And for me, part of the conversation that I want to have through my art is giving more of a chance for Métis to enter into the Indigenous arts industry dialogue in British Columbia, because I feel like we are vastly underrepresented, considering the number of artisans that we do have in this province, while being completely respectful to the First Nations that reside here. The Métis, we are Indigenous, but we are not First Nations. We do not belong to this place. We do not make land claims. We do not ask for anything that is not our own. And it's really important for us to remember that we honor those traditional relationships with First Nations groups without trying to take away anything from them. And so it's important for us to be really sensitive while looking for visibility and for looking for notoriety in the Indigenous arts industry, that we're being very sensitive to the very long, hard-fought battle for First Nations and their recognition in this province, from everything from funding to social relevance. So when it comes to my beadwork, you'll see that it's not very traditional in the motifs that I use. The techniques are very traditional. I use flat beadwork and raised beadwork that is taken in inspiration from the Haudenosaunee and Iroquois nations and from several European styles of beadwork, because I feel like those techniques most accurately represent the real mix of influences that I have artistically. And so exploring both very traditional Indigenous art techniques and European ones, I think it gives a full spectrum to using Indigenous language to describe, using Indigenous vocabulary, such as beadwork, to describe a larger story, because beadwork is really storytelling for me. And so while I'm talking here, I'm actually going to be putting together a moccasin. I've already put together this side, and it is made from brain tan smoked leather, and it just smells like a campfire. It smells like being at the lake and roasting hot dogs and mosquitoes and lake water and campfires, and it's one of my favorite materials to work with. So I'm going to be kind of sewing this together as we talk a little bit about my influences and a little bit about my history and my art. One of the really important things for me in being involved in this project was to give a voice to how important my art was for my own reclamation of my identity. And like I said before, for Métis people growing up in a place that is not their own, we come from Ontario, and we come from the East Coast, and we come from the prairies, and we are descendants of people who were nomadic and traveled because of the fur trade. We're employed by the government, we're employed by private corporations, historically to exploit the North and the fur trade industry. And we're used to not being at home, but we do have a homeland, and it is in Manitoba. It is the Red River settlement and the area surrounding it. I'm originally from Thunder Bay, Ontario. I was born in Thunder Bay, and have really strong connections, cultural connections to that area and the Great Lakes. And while that feels like my home, I have lived in British Columbia my whole life. And for me, my art and my beadwork and reclaiming those skills and carrying those skills on, which I will teach my own children, was a huge part in me finding my identity in being Métis and being a mixed Indigenous person. I find that there's a lot of conversation in the Métis community about that disenfranchisement, that not feeling of a place or not feeling of a people, because, you know, we've all heard that adage about mixed Indigenous people not really belonging to one or the other. You know, they're not really quite white enough to be white, and they're not really quite Native enough to be accepted into a traditional Indigenous community. So we spent a lot of times as a nation, as a community, on the sidelines, and quite often being ignored by a government who didn't consider us Native enough, or, you know, came up with blood quantum to deny people rights, deny my ancestors and other Métis ancestors' rights and other First Nations people's rights based on their blood quantum. And so something like that is one of the things that I actually try very hard in my work to try to dispel, because that's not something that we find important. If you're Oneida, if your grandmother's Oneida, you're Oneida. If you're Cree and your grandfather is Cree, you're Cree. They don't think of you less than because you're something else as well. That makes you twice as much. And I really hope that I can help to remind people that when they're feeling isolated from their communities, they're isolated from their traditions, especially in a time like COVID, that you can use something like art, like learning a new skill, like learning beadwork, to reinforce those connections to your community, even though you are separated from them. So for me, being, like I said, a mixed Indigenous person, it's kind of hard to know where that line is, like where you actually belong. And so for me, I felt like it was really inappropriate, being a Métis person living in British Columbia where we don't have ancestral lands, to do really traditional beadwork, to do really traditional Métis beadwork that looked like all of the beadwork in the museums that I loved and in all of the books that I loved and the historical documents, because it felt disingenuous. It did not feel like me, because I did not grow up in those areas. I grew up separate from those things, and so my education in all of this, although I do have education from my family and heritage, most of my education has been completely on my own. This is something that I've decided to pursue in light of my own search for my own roots and finding meaning in community that springs up around art, and the politics that are fueled by it, and the community interactions and the relationships that are fueled by it. So when I talk a little bit about my designs, like I said, they're not necessarily traditional, and, you know, the Métis being a people constantly on the road, constantly in flux, constantly traveling, they pick up things along the way. And so for me, it's really important that I reflect, that I represent all of my different roots in my work. So I will use traditional beadwork techniques to describe really beautiful, almost Nordic-like Scandinavian patterns. And like I said, using the language of beadwork to tell a story about something else is pretty important to me. So one of the things that I use to explore a lot of my patterns is actually my fabric. So I started Indigenous Nouveau pretty much a year ago at the beginning of COVID, because I was a tattooer full-time, and COVID made tattooing almost impossible at that point and not safe for either clients or for us, because we didn't know what was going on. And so I made the decision to take a complete left turn and to put all of my all of my eggs in a basket and depend completely on starting a new business. So I started Indigenous Nouveau as a fabric company where I make non-denominational and non-nation specific beadwork patterns that are based on traditional Métis patterns that I have learned. They're based on my own heritage. They're based on my own ingenuity, but I always wanted to create fabric that was available for use for everybody, including non-Indigenous people, because they're part of the conversation when it comes to preserving Indigenous art just as much as anybody else. We need our patrons, we need supporters of our art, we need allies, and one of those ways is to not alienate those people. And so I want to make my fabric and my materials non-exclusive. I want everybody to be able to feel like they can use my fabric. And one of the reasons that I really believe in that is because the teachings of the ribbon skirt are something that are very strongly intertwined with most of the work that I do. The ribbon skirt for me is one of the most important features of Indigenous art, where we can really see a relationship between, historical relationships between the first settlers that came here, the first people who came to the prairies, and Indigenous people, because the ribbon skirt actually developed from the European skirt pattern and the buckskin dresses that the women wore on the prairies. And so in the modern ribbon skirt, we see that heritage, we see those connections. And I really do believe that by using teachings of the ribbon skirt and looking at those similarities between communities and looking at the similarities between communities who also use moccasins, we can start to negate a lot of the lateral violence that occurs between us if we look a little bit more at those similarities and realize how actually connected we are, and that we all exist in this place that we call Canada, and it does in some way belong to all of us as stewards. And true cooperation and true elimination of lateral violence only comes from understanding each other. And so for me, being able to provide fabric that any nation, like you could be Lakota, you could be Blackfoot, you could be Haida, you could anyone from any of these nations who uses the traditions of the ribbon skirt can use my fabric, and it's not, like I said, it's non-denominational. It doesn't belong to any one person. Anybody can use it, and anybody can use my fabric to explore their own mission and their own path in reclaiming their own identity. And that's where it comes back to reclamation and reconciliation. I like using the word reclamation more than reconciliation, because I believe that reconciliation is a grassroots project that starts with an individual. And your decision as an individual to create change, and your decision as an individual to change your mind about things, is really the only way that we're going to come to any kind of functional relationship between nations, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And I think that the first step in that is remembering our identities, because you can't have a conversation about what you want and who you are if you don't know who you are. So for me, as a Métis person, my art 100% has been one of the things that has helped me to be extremely confident in what I am, because I wake up in the morning and I know what I am. I don't wake up in the morning and think about what other people are gonna think about me, that I don't look Indigenous enough, or I don't look white enough, or any of those things, or I didn't grow up traditionally in this way, or I grew up too traditionally in another way. I wake up in the morning and I know exactly what I am, because every day I reinforce that with my work, and that exploration is really important to me. So that's something that I really want to be able to share with other people, and by creating these fabrics, I really feel like I've been able to do that, to provide a material for other people to really explore what their identity means to them. And I think that's really powerful. I recently have been going into a different direction with my ventures. I recently taught a workshop on Indigenous entrepreneurship through Métis Nation, British Columbia, and it has really encouraged me to begin to design a course of my own. So my mission in the next year is to develop a course for Indigenous entrepreneurs, and beginning small businesses, and to aid them in entering into e-commerce and the online marketplace, and retaining Indigenous values in their businesses when it comes to every stage of their business, from planning to execution to if you have a fully fledged business and want to reinstate those values into your business. And it's so important when you're talking about something like e-commerce, and you're talking about manufacturing, and you're talking about a distribution and shipping and all of those things. I think that you can only really have a successful Indigenous business if you build it completely on the basis and foundation of sustainability and Indigenous values. So that is part of the reason that I wanted to teach classes. So I've been designing a course based on my troubleshooting, and this is the third Indigenous business that I've owned in the last 10 years, and just through my own self-education and the courses that I've taken, and understanding what I would have needed from a mentor to have built my businesses more quickly and more successfully, I'd like to offer that to the wider Indigenous community of any nations, because they're really important lessons to learn, and I know that education is really inaccessible, and nothing really exists that is completely catered to Indigenous people in particular, because I think it's a really sensitive and really important subject to approach from an Indigenous philosophy. So that really comes down to a lot of what I had been seeing in the Indigenous arts industry for a long time that made me think twice about products that I bought. Because you can go into any Indigenous tourist shop, gift shop, all over British Columbia, and probably about 50% of the items in those stores are made overseas. And that was a really hard thing for me to stomach, where you're supporting an Indigenous artist, you're supporting an Indigenous entrepreneur that owns their own businesses, getting stuff printed, but where that Indigenous value being inherent in their business starts to fall down is where we start getting stuff made in China. We're not supporting local, we're not supporting Canadian or North American infrastructure, we're not supporting ethical and fair wages for workers when we're going overseas for our product and our distribution. And for me, this was a huge aspect of why I wanted to design and print my fabrics the way that I do. So all of my fabrics are actually entirely printed in Canada from North American materials. Nothing about them is made overseas, which makes them a little bit more expensive. So I've decided to take a little bit of a hit on my profit margin with the fabric because it's such an important thing for me to distribute. So like I said, they're all printed in Canada with completely eco-friendly dyes. They are all organic cotton and organic hemp. And I don't sell them for very much more than I actually purchased the fabric for because, like I said, I really do believe that it's important, and some of us do have to try to be trendsetters in shifting the way that the Indigenous art industry produces products that are not handmade, that are printed products, that are mass-produced products. So I hope that by sharing that message, other Indigenous businesses are going to look at that and really say, you know, is it worth paying a couple extra bucks to manufacture this thing in Canada so that I can say with all certainty that I know who made this? Like, I know that that person was paid enough. I know that that person was treated fairly. I know that every single point along the production of that piece was aligned with Indigenous values. And so I really do hope that carries through my work and that people see that, because it's so important for other people when they look at Indigenous businesses for it to ring true, and for us to represent a community in a certain way, and for us to represent the Indigenous arts industry in a certain way, to make sure that we are making decisions as a community about the way that we want to be seen, the way that we want to run our businesses, the way that we want to not compromise our ethics, those types of things. We have to make those decisions as a community, and so that's something that I'm very adamant about. Absolutely. It is a core tenet of the work that I do. Another really big aspect for me, especially because I use a lot of leather, I use a lot of furs, and I own another business called Buy the Thorn, where I'm actually a silversmith as well, and I make bear claw and cougar claw jewelry, and from a lot of different Indigenous materials, but mostly claws and teeth. And so a real huge part of that for me is actually starting to talk to people a little bit more about where their jewelry comes from, because a lot of jewelry is highly unethical as well. So when I talk about my jewelry, and I have it on the website as well, www.buythethorn.com, one of my big initiatives with my jewelry is educating people on land-based practices and traditional Indigenous hunting practices, and how those two things are so essential to the conversation about conservation and climate change in British Columbia. And one of those things for me is that I truly believe that hunters and people who are out on the land, trappers, people who are actually spending time in nature, understanding population density, understanding environments, understanding habitats, and understanding our place in the world are the real true conservationists. And so Indigenous hunters and people that exercise Indigenous land-based practices are so essential to the politics and the success of conservation in this province. And we need to be part of that dialogue, and one of the ways to do that is to change people's understanding about the difference between, you know, factory farming and hunting for your food, you know, things like that. You know, people have a lot of misconceptions about hunting, people have a lot of misconceptions about trapping, and I think that people are a little bit more open to those things if it's seen from an Indigenous perspective, because I think that there's a little bit of credit that is given to Indigenous practices that isn't really necessarily given to the wider hunting community. So if we can start to have conversations about that in a little bit of a safer, a little bit more of a healthier dialogue that doesn't involve a lot of anger, we can have conversations that involve both sides, you know, vegans, animal rights activists, and hunters and trappers, because we all want the same thing, and it's sustainability and it's balance, and we want balanced, healthy ecosystems. So that's part of the conversation that I have when it comes to hunting bears, that we hunt for food, and the claws that I use are all byproducts of the hunting industry, completely for food, for sustenance hunting. There's no animals that I use that are hunted for trophy in any way. Sometimes I do get wolves and wolf claws and wolf skins from governmental culling programs where they've deemed certain populations of wolves especially to be a risk and a danger to some of the, you know, the endangered, nearly extinct southern caribou populations and stuff like that. So it's important for me to start trying to educate people based on actual facts and really based on, again, land-based practices and conservation rather than opinion and rather than what's already out there on the internet, because the conversation is not so black and white. So, yeah, I have quite a huge resource page actually on my website, my jewelry website, about that, as well as resources for teachers to try to incorporate teachings about land-based practices and Indigenous food sovereignty into the classroom, because Indigenous food sovereignty is kind of the core tenet of really everything that we do as traditional artists, from everything from leather to bones, to skins, furs, all of that type of stuff, claws and teeth, really comes from Indigenous people having autonomy and sovereignty over their traditional foods. And that's why we need to be part of the conversation when it comes to conservation, because so many Indigenous communities still rely wholly on native populations of animals, so there's no reason for them to not be part of that conversation. This moccasin is the most beautiful, buttery leather, and it still hurts my hands. Doing my best. I've been doing a lot of quill work in the last couple of days, actually, so I can actually talk about that a little bit as well. The quill work is a little bit harder on my hands because I gotta really pinch those quills. So when we're doing traditional porcupine quill work, we get quills from two different sources. And the two that I use most regularly are completely ethically harvested quills from porcupines. The traditional method is actually to go out into the woods and find yourself a porcupine, and you throw a wool blanket, nice big Hudson's Bay blanket, throw it over that porcupine, and you roll it up like a spring roll. You get two people, and each holds an end of it, and you shake that porcupine, and he'll get quite rattled, and he hisses and makes this really cute vibrating noise to let you know that he's mad, and he'll actually drop his quills directly into the blanket. This does not harm the porcupine in any way, and is how people have traditionally harvested quills for 10,000 years. You can do it with a piece of leather or a sweater even if you don't have a blanket on you. So, and then you sit down and you pick all the quills out. The other method of collecting porcupine quills is actually roadkill, because unfortunately porcupines are not very fast and they cannot outrun cars. They spend quite a bit of time on the road because porcupines are actually quite partial to salt and minerals. So in Ontario, especially in provinces where they still salt the roads, porcupines actually go out onto the road to lick the salt off of them. And so that's why they're often hit on the road, and then they can't actually get off of it. But that's one of the main reasons, is because they're quite, salt is one of their favorite things. So they get hit on the road quite often. So you get a porcupine that's been hit on the road, and if you get them within a few hours, because they start to get pretty stinky after a few hours, especially in any kind of heat, you can pluck all the quills out, and then they're sorted and washed from all the grease, and all the guard hair is taken off, and you can use those for hair roaches and powwow regalia and stuff. But the quills themselves, I actually hand dye all my own quills as well. There are 2 jars on the table there, as well as a piece of quill work that I've been working on the last couple of days. So you can dye quills in very, very vibrant colors that are color fast, and it's definitely more of the traditional methods of the beadwork and the quill work, because quill work actually existed long before beadwork did. And so when the Indigenous people of Turtle Island were actually first exposed to beads, it was their proficiency in quill work that actually allowed them to develop the quill work or the beadwork techniques that we have today, along with European beadwork techniques. But it's actually a lot of the motifs and designs that exist in the quill work that enable us to have these really vibrant and beautiful motifs that we have now. I think that we're pretty close to maybe talking to some of the audience members and taking questions, and I would really appreciate any feedback as well on my presentation. Thank you very much. Merci.
Again.
Thank you. Hi.
So I want to thank everyone for really paying attention. You know, I was looking into the audience here, and you know, I could really tell that they were truly listening to what you were saying. You know, I was even captivated. You know, well, I'm always captivated, but I mean, the information that you provided us, I think you hit the nail on the head when it comes to what Expressions of Reclamation is about. It's about providing everyone who's watching and who's present here the information that we need to get a better understanding of the new relationships that need to be built with non-Indigenous and Indigenous people. You know. But more importantly, what I really, really like about your presentation, what you shared with us, is that your business, your work ethic, you know, the things that you put involved in it, you know, to get to where you are, you know. I hope everyone who's watching here and who's in the audience, you know, that you get an idea of what's involved in being an entrepreneur. You know, I really like the fabrics that was designed and that's being created here, you know, being sold. And I really hope that all of you that are here and everyone who's watching, you know, if you know somebody, support her business. You know, you're not only getting awesome materials, awesome. I'm speechless. I'm speechless with it because it really touches my heart. Like, you know, the things that you're talking about is, you know, this is really the only individual that I have ever met that had spoken about the way that I feel about, you know, our culture. You know, I can relate a little bit with Kai here. I'm a mixed Indigenous person. You know, I say that I have the best of 3 worlds. You know, my father is non-Indigenous. He's a white man. My mother is Odawa. She's from a small community called Shishiguaning on Manitoulin Island. And she had given me up for adoption when I was a baby. And fortunately, I was adopted into a Haudenosaunee family, an Iroquois family. We're known as Oniotaaga or Oneida. And so some of the things that Kaija was talking about, you know, it had actually made me think about my own feelings as growing up. You know, am I Oneida enough? You know, am I white enough? You know, am I Ojibwe enough or Anishinaabe enough? You know, I wasn't. You know, and so, but the best of 3 worlds is that what I got out of it is the language. I got the ceremonies and the culture, but I also got the appreciation of any culture that is shared with me. You know, and that's what your words and what you're sharing has inspired in me and relit that again, you know, of the beautiful gifts that all 3 of my cultures have given me, you know. And so I just want you all to know that when you support Kaija and her businesses here, you know, you're not just supporting her financially, but you're also helping to protect Indigenous people, you know, by giving us an opportunity to share some real information with you, you know. And what I really liked about what you talked about was the relationship between like vegans, you know, and that conversation that needs, we can all get along, you know. I was a hunter for a long time. I just got to a place where I didn't feel right, taking the life of something that was really beautiful. I said, well, it was my sacrifice to the earth, because of it. As a human being, I do believe that we're hurting our mother, the earth, and so I said, I'm no longer going to be taking life, I'm going to be planting my gardens and having that food. And so what I really liked about you and what you had said is that relationship and the communication that, basically I got that we could work together, regardless of our differences. And that's Expressions of Reclamation. We can still be human beings and have our differences of opinions, but we can still be human beings and accept each other, It's our imperfections that make us perfect, is what I believe, And so when you're supporting Kaija and her business, you're not only helping her, but you're helping all Indigenous people. But you're also learning something. She had put information in, and she'd done the research. And so I'm going off on a tangent here, but, that's how I am. I'm really excited and inspired, by what you're doing. And so I want to say thank you for that, Che Miigwech, and, merci, and, in my language, it's Ezogonalunkwane Yawango, so I said, you're a big medicine to me, and thank you very much, So we're going to go into any questions. So if anybody has any questions now, in the audience or online, you're more than welcome to ask, even anybody who's here, who's helping out, if you have any questions, so take it away.
We have one question here. Thank you so much, Kaija, for your presentation. It's really interesting to learn about how your practice balances between the various aspects of your identity and traditions. What are your thoughts on the fine line between appropriation and accessibility with Indigenous art?
I think that there are a lot of different examples of really obvious appropriation and really, I think that more often than not, that line is very gray. I think that as long as you're supporting a business and you're supporting an Indigenous individual, I'm wondering if this question comes from buying and wearing Indigenous art in particular. And I think that as long as you're supporting the individual, they are making it to sell. We love people who are Indigenous or non-Indigenous just wearing our art. We love the appreciation of it. We make it to sell. We have this skill to share that helps to support. It's crazy now that as beadworkers, you can support a family on beadwork now because of non-Indigenous people supporting the Indigenous arts industry. So I would 100% encourage anybody who can support Indigenous artists and buy Indigenous products to do so and not to worry about that in particular. I even talked very briefly about the ribbon skirt and its origins. There's a lot of conversation. I know this is a little bit of a long answer, but there's quite a bit of conversation about non-Indigenous women wearing ribbon skirts. And I think that needs to have a little bit, I think people need to talk about that a little bit more in a conversation because the ribbon skirt actually belongs to a lot of different groups and it comes from a lot of different influences and originally did come from the influence of the European settlers on the prairies. So I think that as long as you're part of the conversation and as long as you're listening and as long as you're asking questions, I'm pretty sure that you're not appropriating.
That is the best answer that I've ever heard, So what I really like about Kaija is the inspiration that I get, I'm kind of rough around the edges, I've been told. I was told if I had a spirit animal, it would be a porcupine, of all things.
Amazing, I love porcupines.
So, speaking of porcupines, they're really cute. And
So cute.
And if you ever watch a YouTube video called, I forget what it's called, but it's porcupine eating a pumpkin. It's cute. The porcupine's name is Teddy. It's really cute. I didn't know porcupines could make noise. But anyways, the inspiration, that's what I really like about how she's talking and what she's talking about is, as artists, we want people, to wear our stuff. We want people to showcase it, to help us out. Some of us are okay to be in an office every day. Some of us need to be creative and work with our hands and use our mind, to bring something, out. And that's how we make a living. And so my biggest thing when it comes to the fine line of appropriation is ask the questions. If you're going to wear something, make sure you know where it comes from. And then if somebody asks you about it, give them the correct information, I think that's important, and that some people say, Tim, you're rough around the edges when it comes to your answers. And my thing is, where I come from, I've had to fight for everything. I had to fight for my Indigenous identity, because I wasn't Indigenous enough growing up in my community, or I wasn't Oneida enough. And so what I really like about Kaija, and again, what you're saying is the peacefulness. She's reminding me to be peaceful. And so that's what I really like about this. And if anyone else has any more questions, ask them. Oh, there's 2 more questions. Okay.
Hi, Kaija. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay?
That's a little bit better.
Sorry, my mask makes it a little hard to hear. I wanted to say thank you very much. This was fantastic, and I learned a lot, and I didn't know what to expect when I came, and I learned a lot about both your art, but also your perspective. And so I have a couple of questions. One is, when did you start doing your art? When did you start doing beadwork?
I actually don't know if I remember ever not doing beadwork. I started my first business when I was 10 years old. My parents gave me my first business loan of $50, and I got a table at a craft fair. And I started Kaija's Beaded Creations. My dad helped me make the business cards, and I sold little beaded like geckos and like keychains and stuff like that at a craft fair at like our local Earth Day celebrations. I grew up in Roberts Creek, super hippie community, and that was my first business. I've always been an entrepreneur, and it really always had to do with beadwork.
Oh, that's fantastic. The other question I have is that when you're working on a piece, because all of your art is such an expression of what's coming from within you, when you're working on a piece, what are the kinds of things that are going through your mind?
There's an adage in the beadwork community that beading is medicine, and it 100% is. I actually do, I've got some interesting quirks. I actually have pretty severe ADHD, and for me, and OCD, I don't know if you've noticed. I definitely have OCD as well. And beadwork is one of the most amazing therapies for me, because it's the only time where I can actually turn my brain off. And I can sit, and I could sit for hours, and I can just focus on that one thing and tune everything out. Sometimes I put a podcast on, and I just learn, like I listen to audiobooks, and I just sit down and do my beadwork, and that, for me, beadwork is the greatest medicine, because it takes the place of medication. I've found a coping mechanism to deal with some of my mental health issues, and it's beadwork.
Well, that's beautiful, and that's an inspiration for a lot of people who
Awesome.
struggle with that.
I totally recommend anybody who's ever thinking about taking up beadwork, you should totally do it. And it doesn't have to look good. You don't have to sell it. It doesn't have to look like what you've seen online. Just the methodology and the meditativeness and how centered you have to be, and the ceremony and the protocol that you go through with yourself and the ritual of beading is so healthy. It's changed my life.
I just wanted to end by saying thank you for thinking about the whole supply chain, and it's just
Awesome.
it's
Thank
just
you.
really thoughtful.
Thank you
and
for
I
acknowledging that.
Really, really like that.
That was a great question.
Yeah.
Questions, and your answers are spot on. Expressions of Reclamation isn't just about building the relationships between non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people. It's a platform for all of us to see the different kinds of Indigenous people that are out there, to learn a little tiny bit about our cultures and where we come from. And that being said, it's not just about the individual and our art and our expression, but it's also about the medicine that's behind it. I can totally relate with you about how it's a medicine for her. For me, I always say arts and craft and creativity saved my life. I was a structural firefighter for 10 years back in my early 20s into my 30s. And I got really stressed out. I have PTSD, the ADHD was kicking in, the OCD was kicking in, but it's the arts and the craft and the creativity that saved my life in the early mornings when I couldn't go to sleep because I was afraid of the pager going off, I was afraid of the bell going off, I was afraid, and I couldn't sleep. So how I use that time was to create things, you know, in my creativity. And so our work, our art, and our expression isn't just about producing something and getting it out there. It's about, you know, our own life and our own medicine. We do it because it helps us. For me, when I see people wearing my stuff, you know, that I make, you know, my clothing, my regalia, my ceremonial items that I make, it makes me feel really good to know that they're helping me out, you know, in my medicine. And so when you're supporting Kaija, you're helping her out in her medicine, you know. I believe we are coming up to an end now, about 5 minutes. So before we wrap up, I wanted to say thank you to everyone that's here, everyone who's witnessing, and your questions are absolutely amazing. You know, I really like it. And more importantly, I appreciate what you're saying. And so I just want to tell everybody quickly that at the end of this showcase, we have a survey, you know. I encourage you to go online, hit the link, fill out the survey. For the ones who are here as well, we'll have the information for you. I'd like Kaija to close it up, you know. It's
Amazing.
yeah.
I want to thank all of you for coming, the wonderful questions. Like, I really appreciate that kind of feedback because it lets me know that other people are thinking about what I said, and they're being critical about what I said. And so it makes me more responsible about the things that I say. And so I love having that feedback. I love being kind of adjudicated by people a little bit. It makes us all more responsible. I would love to just do a really quick plug for my business, Indigenous Nouveau. So it's www.indigenousnouveau.com. My Instagram handle is @IndigenousNouveau, and I'm also on Facebook under Indigenous Nouveau. My jewelry company is called Buy the Thorn, and it has an E at the end, and it's all one word, and you can find links through my social media, both my Indigenous Nouveau and Kaija Heitland tattoos. For that page. I will also be attending the flag raising at Métis headquarters tomorrow in Surrey, British Columbia, and I will have my products there doing a craft fair in kind of a little mini rendezvous craft fair part of the ceremony there at Métis headquarters as well. I really look forward to any feedback anybody has, and you're welcome to send me questions online through Messenger or over email through the website form as well. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for having me, and I just want to thank you so much to all the volunteers here. You guys did a great job. We put everything together really quickly, and thank you very much. I can't tell you enough how important it was for you to have invited me. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Marcy.